I'm going to start this video by talking about avatar models and what an avatar model is. To start with, an avatar model is what a player uses in a game, which most commonly will be the protagonist or main character. Some games let you create and customize a character or avatar. These games let you do this in order to make you more emotionally attached to this character, as you have spent time and care to create them. On the other hand, however, there are also pre-made characters, made to fit the storyline. The player can still have an emotional connection to these characters, because even though the player hasn't spent a lot of time and care to create them, the player still plays as them and can get emotionally attached by just generally spending time with them and getting immersed into the storyline of the game. There is also a thing called an omnipresence model, and this is more for tabletop games rather than games that you use or play as a character. What this does is it lets the player play from a top-down perspective, letting them see everything at once and making the player attached in a different way. The player feels more attached to what they have done or built than one specific character or player. This is because when you are playing as a character, you play the entire game as this character, getting more and more attached, and when you are playing in Omnipresence, you spend much more time on your time building up an area or army of some sort, making you feel more attached as a whole than to one specific character in general. We all know what single player and multiplayer is, right? Well, there is more to the word single player than what you may think. For instance, what classes as single player? A game that you play on your own or by yourself? But not necessarily, because most people who play multiplayer games also do this by the player sitting in a room and playing their console or computer on their own, to other people somewhere else in the world, doing the exact same thing. So what defines single player and makes it different to multiplayer? Well, there isn't much, to be honest. But the main thing that sets it apart from multiplayer is the fact that there is truly no one else, because when you play multiplayer, you will always have somebody there, talking or playing alongside you. Whether that's an annoying 10-year-old or a valued team member, there is, however, some gameplay structures that are much more suited for single player. For example, GTA 5 is a goal-driven narrative-based game in single player. Now that single player is somewhat cleared up, let's move on to multiplayer. Multiplayer is where you can indulge in your game, not just on your own, but with friends. The online experience is quite often more fun than just playing on your own, as you are still going through the emotional roller coaster of the storyline, just instead of doing it by yourself, you have one or more friends along for the ride. Multiplayer has improved over the years with a massive demand for more multiplayer games. The servers have had to improve also, in order to hold a huge amount of players playing multiplayer games. For example, the game PlanetSide 2, which holds somewhere around 6,000 people. There are some gameplay structures suited towards multiplayer, like a game, GTA 5, where you can mess around with friends not having to worry about goals or side quests. Now that we have talked a little about multiplayer and single player, let's move on to linear and non-linear storylines. Storylines that are linear are a lot more restricted to the player than non-linear storylines, as quite often the linear storyline is just a set story for the player to follow with little to no side quests or extras. Whereas on the other hand, there are non-linear storylines, and a non-linear storyline is the complete opposite. A non-linear storyline is a storyline not just set to one specific path, but instead it has lots of alternate options, side quests, and much more. The non-linear storyline, I think, would appeal to the gamer a lot more than a linear storyline, as there is more to do and the quality of the story is generally better. For instance, if you take a look at the game The Last of Us, you can see it has a linear storyline, as you can only follow the specific game story and there are no side quests, as opposed to a game like GTA 5, where there are plenty of extras and things to do. This is because in GTA 5 the story is non-linear, giving the player plenty of extras and things to achieve in the game. A world can either be restrictive or expansive, depending on what type of game it is that you are playing. If the game that you are playing is like Minecraft for example, the world will be expansive, as it is constantly loading and has no boundaries or restrictions. Or if you are playing a game like Forza Motorsport 4, the world is restrictive as you can only follow the track and you can't sidetrack off over a hill somewhere. Now that narrative is covered, I'm going to go on and talk about goals, challenges and rewards in games. So let me start by talking about goals in games. The main goal in most games is to get to the end of the storyline or narrative, but there are also lots of little goals in games, especially in games that have non-linear narrative, like Skyrim, where you can go and do a side quest and achieve goals away from the main storyline. Next I'm going to talk about challenges in games. A challenge in a game is like in Mario Kart, where you have to race around a track aiming to beat a certain time set by the game, or in Assassin's Creed, where you have to follow the man and stay hidden without being seen. How hard a challenge can be is often determined by its difficulty level in the game, or by how far through the game the challenge becomes available. Next are rewards, and rewards are what the player receives for completing a goal or challenge. What reward you receive often depends on what difficulty level the challenge or goal was set to when you completed it. Next I'm going to talk about the level of difficulty in a game. The difficulty can really decide if you are going to pass a level or not. For example, if you take a look at the game Portal and look at its first level, you will see the player is able to easily complete it. And then if you compare it to a later level, you can see the difference in difficulty has gone up a huge amount, as the player may struggle or find that level particularly hard. It is important for game companies to get the difficulty levels in a game right and well balanced, because if they don't and the player starts off on a hard level, it may demotivate them to play the game. There are some exceptions to difficulty. These exceptions especially come in games like Dark Souls, where the player starts the game with the difficulty as hard, but then as they progress through the game, the difficulty goes from hard to even harder. There are also player selective difficulties on a lot of games, and just in case you don't know what player selective is, it's where the player at the start of the game most often choose what difficulty it is and what to play, whether that be hard, medium or easy. Now I'm going to talk about player actions. Player actions are what happens when you click a button on your controller or keyboard. For example, in a game like Mortal Kombat, if you click X, your character might kick or punch. This is a player action caused by the user of the game. These sorts of actions can become increasingly more complicated if needed to be. What I mean by this is combos, like for example if I click A, I might jump, and if I click X, I might kick. But if I want a combo, I might click A followed by X and perform a flying kick. Combinations like these can get extremely complicated, requiring multiple buttons to be pressed in order to perform one super move to beat your opponents. Another way of looking at player actions is motion control. This is used by the controller or console detecting player movement, and then depending on what movement was performed, the in-game character will perform accordingly. This gets the player up and moving, which is good, but the downfall to this idea was that most people don't have enough room in their house to be performing movements without knocking something over or hurting themselves or someone else. Next I'm going to talk about rules, and rules in a game could mean a number of things, so let me elaborate a little. I will start by talking about the rules of physics in a game. A good example of this would be Destiny, as in Destiny, you can travel from planet to planet, and on each one there are a different set of physics. Like if you take our planet and the moon, the gravity is different. This also applies to games, as the player may be able to jump higher or run faster, depending on the rules of physics in the game. There are other rules than just the rules of physics in a game. There are also the cause and effect rules, and for those of you who don't know what these are the rules that state if a player presses X, then this action must be carried out. These rules are in every game and are a big part of the game, as this makes the player in control of whatever happens in the game. There are also rules that are specified to certain games. For example, if you take the game Call of Duty, you can see the number of bullets running out in the bottom right corner. This rule is specific to this game, as there aren't that many other games that do this. Now I'm going to talk about game mechanics, which I sort of touched on a little bit earlier when I was talking about game physics, but now I'm going to talk about something a little different to game physics in a game, and move on to things like the scoring system in a game, and this is quite often used as it is needed in most multiplayer games to distinguish between a winning and a losing team. It is most commonly used in multiplayer, but can be used in single player too, as you can play against an AI or computer. The functionality of a game can also come under game mechanics, as it is important for a game to function properly with no glitches or bugs, in order for the player to get the most out of their game. The majority of the time, companies also have small teams of people who will test for glitches and make sure that the game is functioning properly. Win conditions also come under game functionality, as it is important that the game knows who has won, otherwise the losing team will be rewarded for what the winning team has achieved. Next I'm going to talk about the structure of a game, as this is a big part of the game as well. There are two ways you can structure a game, and we talked about these two ways earlier. You can structure a game in a linear style, where the storyline is just on one set route, with no side quests or extras, and if you structure a game like this, you are much more limited to how you can plan it out, only being able to make a one-way game structure. Whereas if you set the game structure out as non-linear, you have plenty more options, being able to add in side quests and much more. As well as this, the game structure has to flow together and fit, so for example, if you're in a jungle and then the next scene you are in a sea, it doesn't flow very well, unless the storyline requires the character to be jumping from world to world or biome to biome. Finally, I'm going to talk about video game addiction. This is where a player of a game will get to the point where all they want to do is play that game. Video game addiction is quite common in most players, as most of them will have put a substantially large amount of time into a game, whether that's their favourite game or just a game they enjoy to play. Certain games can be more addictive than others, especially games that require you to go up in ranks, as these games are always wanting the player to get to the next rank. It makes the player want to achieve the next rank, and if there is a reward with the rank, it makes the player want it that little bit more. Whether a player just wants to beat a friend or to look good in a game, it can still always drag the player in, making them want to play more and more to achieve these statuses. There are certain games that players can play and lose all of the progress that has been made. For the players that are addicted to these sorts of games, it can lead to lots of frustration and anger, as the player has more than likely put a lot of time and effort into whatever they have achieved in that game.